It's not about you. It's always about me. That's powerful. It's always about Jesus. But I also like when he describes grace as God's crazy love. And it is a crazy love. Because when we think about grace, it's not comfortable. You know? I like a world where I get what I deserve. I don't like a world where I don't get what I don't deserve. I even like a world where if I screw up, I have to live with the consequences of my screw up. You know? Grace is an uncomfortable thing. It makes the world we live in fall apart. God giving us crazy love. Something we don't deserve. We need to keep that in mind today as we think about the parable Jesus gives today in our reading. Because the parable he gives is a very uncomfortable parable. It's a parable that if you just read it at face value, shouldn't leave you comfortable in any way, shape, or form. Nevertheless, that grace is a piece of the parable, and if we're not careful, we'll miss the grace of what Jesus is trying to do with that parable. But I want to get at it indirectly to help us hear it better and think about it better. And to do that, part of what I've been doing as I've been thinking about this passage is reflecting. And one of the things that struck me is reflecting on my own life in a couple of ways. And one was thinking about my mom. My mom was one of 7 kids. In fact, they were all born in a little under 10 years, period. So that was almost a kid a year. So the biggest gap was a little hair over a year. But my mom and her family were not wealthy. In fact, they were poor. They were poor enough that I've been to the house where she spent most of her time growing up and been in a room. And that room was big enough for 2 double beds, 2 dressers, enough space for one person to walk between them to the closet door and the exit. And she was one of 4 girls and 3 boys. She grew up in that room with her 3 sisters. So her entire life, she shared a bedroom with a bed with a sister next to a bed with 2 sisters. All of her life. And her brothers had a room smaller where they had 2 bunk beds, a bed, and enough walking space for a person to walk to a dresser, closet, and out. And then mom and dad had a room, and they had a little living room where when all 9 of them were together, it was a full living room. And enough space to put 9 people around the table. And then a kitchen where 1, maybe 2 people could be in it at a time because of the size. And so she was never in that room by herself growing up. In fact, when her oldest sister went to college, was the first time there were only 3 in the room. When her next oldest sister went off to college, she got to have a room with just 1 sister. And actually had her own bed for the first time in her life. And then she went off for school herself. And what intrigues me about that is those 7 kids all did significantly better than her parents. All married and moved away into each a different state for the most part, but never stopped talking to each other at least once a week for an hour, if not more. And no matter how far away they lived, had this incredible closeness and tightness that had something to do with them living together in the way they did. When I look back to my growing up, I had an older sister and a younger brother, and my parents wanted to do better and to give us what they didn't have. Now, when I was younger, I actually shared a room with my brother. We had a tiny room, and there were 2 beds, and there was a little bit of space between the 2 beds. I could almost hit him from his bed. Not that I ever hit my brother, mind you. I was a good kid, an angel. And by the time I was in 5th grade, my dad had taken our attic, remodeled it to 2 bedrooms, and I got my own bedroom, and my sister got her own, and my brother had his own. And so from then on, I grew up in my own room and had a way in which I could get away from my brother or my sister whenever I wanted. And what's interesting is now that I'm in the middle of my adulthood, the relationship I had with my siblings was nowhere near as deep as the relationship my mom had with hers. And I was able to grow up and hide myself in my room, whereas she could never hide herself from other people, and developed interesting bonds because of that, which is intriguing. When I was in high school, I got my first Walkman clone, which was a big deal. And my kids have no idea what a Walkman is. But, you know, I had my little clone where you put your cassette in, and I got that in high school, and from the day I got that, everywhere I went with the family, I had headphones on with my music up loud enough so that I could ignore everybody around me. And my parents would get mad because they'd have to hit me to get me out of my music so that they could talk to me about something. And I created ways of isolating myself, you know. What's interesting is we're in the day of technology, which we're claiming is bringing us closer together, but oftentimes it doesn't. Well, 2 weeks ago, Louis C.K., a well-known comedian, was on Conan O'Brien, and he talked about how he won't let his daughters have cell phones. And it became one of the most watched video clips. And he said, why would I let my daughters have cell phones when all they do is make you dumber? Was his comment. He says, look, kids do kid things, and some of those things are mean. There's something about being on the playground with another kid and saying something really mean and nasty to them where you see their face contort from what you said that changes you, and you realize, I don't like what that did to them. And if someone did that to me, now that I think about it, I probably wouldn't like it as well. And he says, if my kids are on a phone, they don't know that. They can say mean things and just move on and say another mean thing because they are not seeing face to face to realize that. That's just like doing suicide prevention and been paying attention to Facebook, because some people see Facebook as a way for, build communication in some of the social media. And 2 studies have come out. And the first study was on people who have mild psychosis, thinking that Facebook would be the natural cure for that. And what they found is it actually makes it worse, because you can never be for sure the person you're talking to is a real person or the person you think you're talking to on Facebook. And the second one was done by University of Michigan, was looking at aloneness and loneliness, and the Facebook is supposed to connect you with people, but the reality is all it really does is it gets you to share information. I'm Facebook connected to a whole bunch of people I went to high school with, and once in a while I'll go look at someone's profile. Oh, so they're doing this for a living, and they're married, and they have this many kids, and I'll gather information about them, but I'll not really interact with them. Or will I learn anything that really says who they are? And so part of what I'm noticing in our world is we've made some real big changes. Like, let me illustrate it this way. 40 years ago, the average American house was 12,000 square feet.
12,000?
12,000 square, not 12,000, 1,200 square feet. 1,200 square feet, sorry, I said that right. 1,200 square feet. And we had 8 people in that house. Today, the average house is 2,400 square feet, and we have 4 or less people. So if you want to know why the cost of everything goes up, here's a classic example. We are doubling the size of our house and putting half the number of people in it, which means we need more houses to feed all 8 people into houses. And the houses we're building for each other is twice the size as what they were 40 years ago. How many TV shows have you seen where there's kids and more than one of them lives in a room together? I remember the Brady Bunch, where they had 3 boys in one room, 3 girls in one room. You watch a TV show today, guess what? Everybody has their own room. Not interesting. And it kind of gets in the way, I think, of building relationships. And I used to think it was great having my own room and thought this was the best thing in the world. Now, later in life, looking back, I'm like, I'm wondering if this was such a great idea. And when I listen to Louis C.K. saying, look, you kind of need to be face-to-face to learn certain things about people and yourself and how to relate to people that you can't learn any other way. There's something about that. So why do I bring this up? Because this is what Jesus has been doing. And it's not just this parable. If we take this parable at face value, this parable is ugly. Because what does this parable simply say? It simply says, and if you read it just straight up literally, you have a rich man who's living his dream, and you have a beggar outside of his gate, And he's taking the leftovers and throwing them out to feed them, and it lands him in hell, Hades or hell, where he's eternally tormented. At face value, it simply says, if you are not using more than what you don't need to help out people in need, that's going to land you in hell. You know, that's uncomfortable. At its face value, if it says you take your abundance and you give it to someone in need, that isn't what God's asking. God's asking for more. So at the face level, it's a very uncomfortable parable to hear. But it's in a context. It's in the context of Jesus telling a bunch of parables and saying a bunch of things where he starts with by painting a picture of God as a shepherd who seeks out one lost sheep. As God as a woman who hunts down one lost coin. He has the parable of the prodigal son where he says God is a forgiving father who forgives the son who went away and forgives the son who stayed behind and was haughty and arrogant and proud and boastful, and forgives them both because what he wants is to love and care for them. And he tells the parable of the rich man and the corrupt manager, where the corrupt manager is dishonest with the things, is going to get fired, and does more dishonesty to the point at which the rich man, the boss, allows his dishonesty. And in the context of what Jesus is doing, Jesus' whole point is are you focusing on the things you have in your life as if they're there for you, or are you focusing on them as if they were given to you to build relationships with others? And here you have this last parable in this series. And Jesus is really, in a way, upping the ante in an uncomfortable way, because he's simply saying to us, how are you thinking about what you have and who you encounter in your life? Here's Lazarus, who was a beggar, for whatever reason, living outside of the gate, and the rich man who knew he was there. Well, you know, and he was nice. Instead of having the scraps be set aside for using in another meal or to be used as leftovers, would at least throw them out for Lazarus to have something to eat. Isn't that charitable? He didn't need them, so he threw them out and gave them to someone who did. Isn't he loving, compassionate, caring? You know, took the scraps as extras, gave it to someone in need, right? Aware of them, but didn't build any relationship with them. Isn't that interesting? And it's an interesting parable because it doesn't say that the angels took Lazarus to heaven. It says the angels took Lazarus to be with Abraham. And the rich man found himself being tormented in Hades, the Jewish word for hell. And over this chasm, he could see Lazarus with Abraham. And he calls up to Abraham, not to Lazarus. And he says, could you make, that beggar, Lazarus, come dip his finger in water for me to give me comfort. I did toss him scraps to live on. And Abraham says, I'm sorry. You got it. You had the abundance already. You got it. God's kingdom doesn't play by our rules. God's kingdom doesn't play by human rules. God's got a different set of rules. You had your abundance here on earth, and you didn't use it for others. You used it for yourself. Sorry. Have a luck. And there's no way he can come and comfort you. Hard parable. And even when the rich man says to him, well, I got a father and I got brothers who are doing the same thing I was. Send them to him. And Abraham says, you got the word of God. And if the word of God doesn't help you see who God is and what God expects of you, how is a dead person who's come back going to do it? What a fascinating parable. And it's not Jesus, I don't think it's Jesus coming along saying, I want to condemn people, because all along in this whole sequence of his teaching, he's been trying to help people get the grace of God. He's been trying to help people get that God does not give us a life just because God's saying, I want to give this person a life so they have a life. That God actually has expectations of what each one of us does with our life at every point in our life. And those expectations aren't about anything we accumulate, but are about relationships we build with people. And that's scary. That's really uncomfortable, Because it's not always easy to build relationships with people. It's not always easy to risk our stuff to build relationships with people. It's easier to take the stuff we have and build a wall around ourselves. But here Jesus is basically saying, rich man, guess what? You built a wall. Lazarus stayed outside of the gate. And all you did was throw a little bit of your scraps over to keep him alive. What Jesus is trying to do is to say life is at its fullest. We are fully human in the times in which we risk ourselves to draw closer to other people. And not just the ones that it's natural to do it with. That we come most alive when we risk ourselves in relationships with other people. And we find God the most alive when we risk ourselves in relationship with other people. That's why every time Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? He's not thinking in commandments in terms of here's law and here's rules you follow. He says, love God with all that you are and never leaves the and off. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then you'll get everything God is about. That's profound. That you can't simply love God. Our pietism tells us we can simply love God, or our pietism tells us we can be a good person. But could you say the rich man was that bad of a person? He gave his leftovers to Lazarus to keep going. But Jesus, in this whole sequence, is pushing us. How do we think about what we have in terms of building relationships with the people around us? And at the center of those relationships is struggling with what does it mean to love and to really be loved, which takes vulnerability, which takes time, which takes energy. Looking back at my own high school experience, I'm realizing how much I closed myself off from my own siblings. And so part of the lack of relationship I had with them was my own doing. I found a way to run and hide and to isolate myself. And I watched some of my kids and some of the friends they bring around, and interesting how they interact sometimes, and how much of it is spent on devices, and on devices, how much stuff is said. Yeah. The new knock on Twitter is, it's where angry people go to vent. And if you read Twitter posts at all, it's pretty obvious. Or go to any major news outlet, read one article, and then start reading the posts. And it won't take but 2 or 3 before you start getting people angry, ranting, and raving about stuff that has nothing to do with the article. Are we really communicating? Are we really building relationships? I was in line at the bank the other day, and in front of me were 2 teenage boys who were sharing stories, and the story they were sharing with each other was they remember the first time getting X game, putting it in their game system at home, and sitting in a room by themselves all night and achieving their first playthrough, getting to this level. And I'm listening to 2 people swapping stories to connect about how they sat in a room by themselves playing a video game. And I'm like, wow. And their connection was the fact that they had done a similar thing by themselves in a room alone. I know, when I was young, video games were just coming out, but my friends and I looked for the video games where we'd have to work together with 2 or 3 of us sitting in chairs, huddled. Well, let's map out this part of it. Let's taking pencil and paper and talking through. And it was the fun of that interaction, because when they left, I didn't notice I could play the video game. You know? And realizing that the video game was cool, but what was cooler was playing it with the friends where we're sitting there talking the whole time and drinking junk food and eating junk food while we're doing it. What Jesus is trying to do is not trying to guilt us, condemn us, shame us, but he's trying to wake us up to the potential God put in each one of us. And that potential comes from us realizing it's about people and not things. And that God has expectations of what we do with our life, and it has nothing to do with financial achievements, with the size of home we achieve, with the kind of car we drive, but it has everything to do with whatever relationships we build with the people around us. And how much of ourselves do we put into and give away into those relationships, and how much do we let others give to us in the same way? You know, it's not about me giving myself to this person and then walling them off. It's about me letting it go both ways. You know, what's been interesting in some of my theological readings is I've read more than one place that's been talking about the early church, and in the first 300 years of the church, how the church dealt with helping people in need within their midst. There's many different ways. Acts shows a bunch, some of which are very uncomfortable. But there's many different ways, and one of the most common ones for the first 300 years was if I was in need of food or finances to fix something on my house or for my business, and you wanted to help me and had the resources to help me, the only way you could help me is you had to make yourself vulnerable to me to the degree of which I was being vulnerable to you to ask for help or to receive that help. In other words, the most common thing is that I would have to go to you. If I was the one who could help you, I would have to go to you and give a piece of myself, a vulnerable piece, like say, I'm struggling with this and no one else in my life knows it, and I need you to now know it, which makes me vulnerable and accountable to you, and I need you to be my prayer warrior. And to the degree of which I am vulnerable with myself to you, you can then turn around and give me food or give me money. And that was part of why the church grew. Because you couldn't just give someone something because they needed it. You had to give it within the context of seeing we're the same. And I'm making myself equal to you in vulnerability as you are to me with your need. And the church grew. Toppled the Roman Empire. That was one of the key pieces. Jesus is pushing us to think about what we have and what we do with our life. And are we building relationships with people? And that's our challenge. Where this week are you going to find an opportunity to build a relationship differently? Let us pray.